Hi, great to be here again. JD and I reminded each other that it was 3 years ago. I was here visiting your group, and I noticed recognized some faces here, where we talked about how the hydroplate theory gives an explanation for the true cause of earthquakes and why they will be global someday. And if you missed that, we had, before I came here, I did the same presentation a little bit longer down in Costa Mesa, California, and you can go and see that at our website. If you go to Calvary PO for Calvary Port Orchard, calvarypo.org, go to the media, go to our YouTube channel, and under our YouTube channel we have various different presentations, one of them being Earthquakes 2012 Update, and you can watch that. And if everything works out right technically here today, we're going to be, Conrad back there, Kane, he's our sound and video guy in the church, and we're going to be putting this on YouTube. So you'll be able to, if you enjoyed this, missed something, wanted to understand, it's going to be free on YouTube. And that'll be available. I wanted to, just a second here. Before we actually get into the presentation, wanted to say that the presentation is going to be based on Dr. Walt Brown's work. Dr. Walt Brown is the originator of what's called the Hydroplate Theory Explanation for the Flood of Noah, and this is his 8th edition book. And if you want to get a book, you can get it from Creation Science, from his ministry, CSC, by just typing in creationscience.com, going to his online website. But you don't have to buy the book, you can read it online. And actually what you read online is the 9th edition. This is the 8th edition, and as soon as this was published, his online book just kept on getting updated and improved, and it's going to continue to do so until he runs out of the 8th edition. Then he'll snapshot that off of the website and put that into print, and that'll be the 9th and final edition. So right now, the 9th edition has a lot of information that's not contained in the 8th edition hard print that's on the website. Some of the things I'll be sharing with you today are not on the book, are not in the published book, but they're on the online book. And if you want to just get an up-to-date version in PDF format, you can go to creationscience.com. You can spend $10 and get this CD, which is a PDF version of As If He Were to Make the Book Today, that's available. And so I have printed off for you on the freebie table over there the chapter on asteroids based on 2 months ago. So Dr. Brown sent this to me knowing I was going to be coming here, and said, I wanted to get the latest, greatest. And I printed off asteroid chapters for you. And this is what you have here. So what I'm going to be teaching is not in the book, but is on the website and on the CD. And the punchline of today's message is going to be based on these. Everybody know what those are? Extreme orbit TNOs that have befuddled, totally baffled the astronomers. Anybody heard recently in the last few months the Planet X? There's a Planet X out there and made national news, etc. And we're going to get to a punchline on this, and this will help. This is out of I wrote it on the PowerPoint, Science magazine. It's out of a magazine, Science magazine, and it'll be part of our PowerPoint presentation. So I don't want to waste any more time here. We got hopefully about an hour to be able to finish this presentation, and so let's pray one more time. Father, we just thank you for this opportunity. And Lord, I pray that you'd help me in just communicating this difficult subject in a way that your people, Lord, can stand in awe of really what's happened in the past, Lord, in the judgment of Noah's day, and how Peter tells us that the world is reserved for another judgment, this time by fire, and how some of the things that are actually put into space as a result of the flood of Noah is, your word says, are coming back to earth and might be part of that judgment of fire. And Lord, we just stand in awe that you loved us so much you sent Jesus that we could be spared of the wrath, not just of the things coming upon the earth, but the things that would be eternal damnation if we don't get forgiven of sin, and that you've made a way for us to get back into a relationship with you. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. So if this works right, we should be on slide 1. And so hydroplate theory, the origin of comets, asteroids, meteoroids, and TNOs. And I want to let you know that a friend of mine, Brian Nickel, put together a lot of the animations in these slides that I'm going to be giving today. He's a mechanical engineer from Raytheon Corporation, a defense contractor. You'll find that a lot of mechanical engineers that will carefully read Dr. Brown's book, they're sold. It all makes total mechanical engineering sense. He's devoted hundreds and hundreds of man-hours to making a 6-part animated series that are posted on his YouTube channel. So you can go to YouTube, you can search on Brian Nickel hydroplate theory, you can get into his part 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and he also has the origin of Earth's radioactivity. And I would strongly encourage you, it's basically presented for an engineering science mind. If you didn't have that education, it might be a little bit tough, but it's very powerful animations, and we're going to see some of those animations here in our presentation today. And so that's the creationscience.com. Dr. Walt Brown's online book is really the source of everything that we're going to be teaching today. So what can we learn from the Bible on the topic of comets, asteroids, and TNOs? I mean, most of you that have read through the whole Bible, it probably doesn't say, well, you know, comets came from the earth and asteroids, but does the Bible have anything that would help us to understand where they came from? And I think it does, because in Genesis chapter 1, what did God say on the end of the 6th day of creation? He said everything was good, very good. And we know from history that many comets and meteorites have impacted the earth, creating massive death and destruction. We have mega tsunamis, the evidence of mega tsunamis that were impacts of major asteroids, comets, or meteorites that hit the ocean, sent tsunamis hundreds of feet high. They have evidence of that in some of the shores down in South America, etc. And they can know exactly where it landed because they have Australia and South America, and they have places where these mega tsunamis, and they triangulated and said this is where it hit. There was also a time in 1908, many of you have probably heard about this. In 1908, there was a meteor that exploded above Siberia and laid down leveled 800 square miles of forest. Didn't leave a crater, but it leveled 800 square miles of forest because the comet, there was a lot of water with it, so it was a comet or an asteroid, and we're going to talk about how they're actually kind of similar. Must have just skimmed and hit the Earth's atmosphere, and the shock wave of the atmosphere just laid down the forest because the debris didn't actually hit the Earth. The water that was with this comet or asteroid became a noctilucent cloud, and people in Britain were going, why can we read our newspapers in the middle of the night? Because it had created this reflective cloud that made the night like day in Britain. They could read their newspapers. It was light enough. They didn't understand why. There wasn't Facebook to say, wow, we just had a major meteor lay down the forest here in Siberia. So there was massive destructions equal to 185 Hiroshima bombs.
Is that in Siberia?
Yeah, the Siberian, the comet came and the shock wave laid down the forest in the area of Siberia. And you can Google this stuff, and this actually came from SmithsonianMagazine.com. And so there is great concern that a future meteorite, comet, asteroid could wipe out life on Earth. How many have heard recent news reports that, hey, we've got to make a telescope, we got to have, the governments of the world are putting a lot of time and money in scanning the skies to be able to determine whether there's an asteroid or comet or meteorite with our name on it, so that we can have some time to react. We've been closely shaven by these things recently, and sometimes it's like, whoa, look at that, it just missed us. You know, they don't even know what's coming, and they just see it on the way out, and they go, whoa, that was a close one, almost got us. And so recently, this is March 3rd article that hit national news. Scientists develop mini Death Star to protect us from asteroids. And what they're going to do is send up if we get enough warning, because the telescopes and the other sensors are picking up on an asteroid that's coming with our address, they're going to put up this spacecraft that is going to use solar panels and everything to create a laser and start burning at the asteroid. And burning the asteroid is going to create an atmosphere around the asteroid, and that atmosphere is going to give a push to the asteroid and lightly push it out of the orbit of hitting the Earth. That's their current best plan that they're working on. So, if it is to be taken literal, the Bible says that Earth will someday be struck by something from space. In other words, and I do take Revelation literal as much as you can within context of the rest of Scripture, and it says that in Revelation chapter 8, verse 10, a time yet future as far as I'm concerned. I think there's no, it's very difficult to read Revelation without seeing that this is talking about a future time. Then the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the water because it was made bitter. Now, I'm going to tell you that I think meteors and asteroids and other space debris actually was jettisoned from the Earth. So why would stuff coming back to the Earth embitter the water? I don't know. Except here's one thought. Wormwood in Russian is Chernobyl. So what if the Earth were to be impacted with a comet, asteroid, that brought such devastation that there became, and the Bible talks about earthquakes that are just tear the place apart during the tribulation period. What if the reactor plants of the area impacted, like Europe, which has, I would say hundreds, except I'll be conservative and say dozens and dozens of reactor plants across Europe and America, if there was a beyond design earthquake that occurred as a result of that, they would melt down just like Fukushima did in Japan. And just like in Japan, when a reactor melts down and there is no cooling there, they're still trying to find out where did the cores go, because we know they burrowed through the reactor vessel. We're just not sure whether it burrowed all the way through the containment cement floor into the groundwater of Japan. That's why they're really trying to find out where those cores are at, and they can't send in remote probes that can survive the radiation to get close enough to know. And I've been following this because of my background in reactor plant stuff, and really, so if these things are still burrowing down and it gets into the water table, you know what's going to happen in Japan? People are going to be drinking water and they're going to be thinking everything's fine until they'll go, oh, I don't feel good. Oh, all of a sudden I really feel bad, and they'll drop dead because of the bitterness that's in the water. And if there were a comet that were to hit, or a meteorite that caused that kind of devastation on Earth, what would they call it? Chernobyl. They might call it Chernobyl because of the history of Chernobyl, or call it Fukushima or something else like that. And so it could be that's why they're doing it. But this, I do think that the Bible makes it clear that the Earth is going to be impacted during the tribulation period by things that are in space in a way that will cause great devastation on the Earth. There's other verses that pertain to that. Jesus said that people's hearts will fail them for the things that are coming upon the Earth. You remember that verse in Matthew 24? Well, it's actually Luke 21. So what if they get, oh, there's an asteroid coming, and oh, we don't have time to put up a space probe. Oh, our laser's not going to work, and people's hearts will fail them, just like they've made movies about, because they know that tomorrow this thing is going to destroy all life on this city, this state, this country, because of what's going to happen. Men's hearts will fail them for the things that are coming upon the Earth. So when God created the world, it was good. Meteorites, comets, asteroids are not good as far as we're concerned. I mean, it'd be great if they stayed out there, but we know they don't. They haven't in the past, might not in the future. So God has either created these tools of destruction after the fall of man. So maybe when we fell, along with malaria and snakes changing to want to bite us and be venomous, and lions no longer eating straw, they want to eat you and eat the lamb that they lie down next to, and all the other things that happen in the fall of man. Maybe God just said, okay, I'm going to create a bunch of stuff in space that's going to bring judgment later on in life. Maybe he did that, or I think these objects came about from what was already the creation, that as a result of the flood. That the flood was, one of the mechanisms of the flood was to send debris up into space that is now turned into these orbital bodies in our solar system and will be used by God as judgment in the last days, along with testifying. See, it testifies. When I look up and I see a comet, I say, that's a testament of God's judgment, Noah's flood. To me, it's like a rainbow. It's reminding me of what happened in the past. So, if these objects originated as a result of Noah's flood, then there is only one flood theory that can scientifically explain how. You know, that you have Ken Hovind years ago, he and I talked on the phone. I believe that the flood was caused by a comet that crashed into the Earth. He doesn't think that comets are a result of the flood. He thinks comet caused the flood. ICR and catastrophic plate tectonic theory, they don't say that there's any way. They don't even propose that comets and asteroids came. There's only one that says that it came as a result of the flood, and that's Dr. Walt Brown's hydroplate theory. And it's also, which by the way, HPT, hydroplate theory, is the only flood explanation that is perfectly consistent with the biblical account of Noah's flood. How CPT supposedly started is not consistent with the flood of Noah. It is not advertising that it originated as the fountains of the great deep that burst up in one day and created the global rainfall. It's different than that. We're not going to talk about what they believe in, but hydroplate theory alone, every single verse in the Bible, and just like JD just told us, it's not just Genesis 7 and on. You've got Psalms, you've got Proverbs, you've got verses all over the Bible. Every single verse of the Bible that pertains to the flood is consistent with the hydroplate theory explanation for the flood. And unlike catastrophic plate tectonics, the hydroplate theory does not require any miracles in order to work. Dr. Brown's only assumption is that when God created the earth, that there was a overlying crust that had in places pillars, places that the crust reached down through the subterranean water. There was water underneath the crust. He's gone from a half mile thick to at least 0.9 miles thick, and actually with the discoveries of trans-Neptunian objects and all the water that's involved with that, they now, Walt says it's more than that, but I'm not going to say how much because it's impossible to know. But a thick layer of water underneath the crust, and that water was heating up, as we're going to talk about in a minute, and led to the fracture of the crust. But I also wanted to emphasize that all the evidence coming in from telescopes, space probes sent to comets, asteroids, TNOs, trans-Neptunian objects, which are objects that are outside spend part or all of their time outside of Neptune's orbit, are called TNOs, is consistent with the hydroplate theory explanation of their origin. And this is to the point where Dr. Brown has predicted in writing what they would find when the Stardust space probe went behind a comet, caught the comet tail dust, brought it back to America, landed in the desert. That whole idea was put together by Dr. Brownlee, no relation to Dr. Brown. Dr. Brownlee at the University of Washington sent a space probe up there, and his mission that he got Congress to fund was, this is a pristine comet. This has only been in the solar system this many times. We're going to get the pristine beginnings of the Big Bang. We're going to bring back proof of the Big Bang. And Dr. Brown said, no, they're not. They're going to get a bunch of evidence that the thing came from the Earth. And he wrote down all the things that they're going to find. And I and others encouraged him, get it, even though it's in your book, put it in an email dated to me right now. And I was at the University of Washington when Dr. Brownlee was giving his public address of what they found on the Build 2 comet. A couple, 300 people there, maybe more. And he was supposed to be spending all the time on all the great evidence, proof of the Big Bang. He spent almost the entire time talking about how great the rocket engines were, how much time they put into inventing aerogel that caught this stuff, how it brought it back to Earth, what great achievements on the mechanical spacecraft itself, and then started to say, and what we found on there, we don't know how it got there. I don't know that we ever will. And then I went up to him after he gave the presentation, and I said, Dr. Brownlee, here's an email I got from Dr. Brown, and it predicted everything that you just said you found, that you don't have an understanding of where it came from. And then I gave him a copy of the Comet chapter from Dr. Brown's book. Later on, he didn't say it there at the presentation, and I had asked him, did you find any organics? And he didn't answer the question. They had found left-handed amino acids, glycine, and they were so shocked when people were saying, no, there's no, you guys contaminated your spacecraft. You did not use proper protocol. So for over 2 years, they're ruling out, they're making sure there was no way, and then they went public with the fact they found glycine. And then I called him up. I said, Dr. Brownlee, remember me? I gave you the. He didn't blow me off. He didn't hang up the phone. I told him, you're probably pretty surprised. He says, yes, we're very surprised to find glycine amino acid up on this Build 2 spacecraft. And so we had an interesting talk, and I told him that, did you read it? No, because it's not the way we know it happened. And I said, well, just because of the evidence that's supporting it, why don't you just go home and read it, even if it's under your bed sheets at night? You really should at least read this. That's what I said. He didn't hang up on me. He didn't blow me off. And I say that just to say, these people are struggling. The scientists are struggling with what they're finding in space that is so contrary to what they expect and so inexplainable by the Big Bang philosophies and ideas that they have, and perfectly consistent with a hydroplate theory that these objects came from the Earth. So now this is an overall summary of the hydroplate theory. If you've never heard about the hydroplate theory, what Dr. Brown's going to do is explain this. This updated video animation with Dr. Brown's narration was done by a friend of mine, Mike Snavely, and he allowed me to use this. And so we're going to listen to this. It's going to be more than what our topic is, but it'll help give you an overview. And there are some updated, he's going to say the crust was 10 miles thick. Now it's 60 miles thick because of the TNOs, and I'll explain that. The water thickness underneath the crust is different. So we'll talk about that, but let's watch this now.
We can see on our planet many strange features that can now be linked together and systematically explained as a result of a cataclysmic global flood, whose waters erupted from subterranean chambers with an energy release exceeding the explosion of 10 billion hydrogen bombs. This explanation shows how major mountains formed very quickly. It explains our coal, oil, and methane deposits, rapid continental drift, why we find on the ocean floor huge trenches, hundreds of canyons, and tens of thousands of volcanoes. It explains the formation of the layered strata and almost all fossils, the frozen mammoths, the so-called ice ages, and major land canyons, especially the Grand Canyon. The pre-flood Earth probably had only one very large supercontinent covered with lush vegetation. There were rivers and seas. The mountains were smaller than today's, perhaps 5,000 feet high. According to the hydroplate theory, about half the water that is now in our oceans was originally in interconnected subterranean chambers. This water formed a thin spherical shell about 3/4 of a mile thick, perhaps 10 miles below the surface of the pre-flood Earth. Increasing pressure in the subterranean water stretched the crust, just as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Failure in the crust began with a microscopic crack which grew in both directions at about 2 miles a second. This crack, following the path of least resistance, encircled the globe in less than 3 hours. As the crack raced around the Earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a rip in a tightly stretched cloth. The subterranean water was under extreme pressure because of the weight of the 10 miles of rock pressing down on it. So the water exploded violently out of the rupture. All along this globe-encircling crack, fountains of water jetted supersonically into and far above the atmosphere. The spray from these enormous fountains produced torrential rains, such as the earth has never experienced before or after. The Bible states that all the fountains of the great deep burst open on one day. And it describes these events about 5,000 years ago that we can now tie together scientifically in cause and effect order. Some of the water jetting high above the stratosphere froze into supercooled ice crystals and produced massive ice domes, burying, suffocating, and instantly freezing many animals, including the frozen mammoths of Siberia and Alaska. The high-pressure fountains eroded the crumbling rock on both sides of the crack, producing huge volumes of sediments that settled out of this muddy water all over the earth. The sediments trapped and quickly buried plants and animals, forming the fossil record. Vegetation uprooted by the floodwaters accumulated in certain regions where it was buried and compressed, rapidly becoming our coal, oil, and methane deposits by processes we can duplicate in the laboratory today. Eventually, the rupture became so wide that the newly exposed compressed rock beneath the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the Earth like the seam of a baseball. The continental plates, the hydroplates, with lubricating water still beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of about 45 miles an hour, they ran into resistances and, like a crashing continental-sized train, compressed, crushed, and buckled. As the continents crushed and thickened, they rose out of the floodwaters. The portion of the hydroplates that buckled down formed ocean trenches. Those that buckled upward formed mountains. This is why the major mountain chains are generally parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. This also explains why today's continents do not have the jigsaw fit against each other as so many textbooks mistakenly claim. Instead, the continents would fit much better against the base of the mid-Atlantic ridge, where the continental drift began. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the mid-Atlantic ridge, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters eventually drained. This rapid continental drift and the resulting compression and buckling was so cataclysmic that it occurred within a single day. Immediately after the flood, sea level was considerably lower than it is today, so land bridges connected every continent. This allowed people and animals to spread over and repopulate the post-flood Earth. As the thickened continents slowly sank into the Earth's mantle, the new and very deep ocean floors had to rise in compensation for the downward flow of mass. Therefore, sea level rose slowly for a few centuries after the flood and eventually reached today's level. As sea level rose, river channels were drowned, channels that had been cut down to the lowered sea level by the heavy drainage after the flood. This explains the famous submarine canyons that are extensions of our major rivers, such as the Amazon, the Congo, the Indus, the Hudson, and the Ganges. Because some submarine canyons are almost 3 miles below today's sea level, we can conclude that sea level and some seafloors were about 3 miles lower than today. The rising sea eventually flooded the land bridges and produced the look of the continents as they appear today, separated by water. As the floodwaters drained off the continents, every continental basin was naturally left brimful of water, producing many post-flood lakes. Because of local conditions, some of these lakes simply dried up. Others continued to collect water from rainfall and drainage from higher elevations. Sometimes a large lake spilled over its rim at the lowest point, eroding a notch. If the rim wall was composed of sediments that were still soft, the escaping water quickly enlarged and deepened the notch. As the volume and speed of the escaping water increased, so did its eroding power, until the entire lake surged through a deep slit, forming a canyon. The largest canyon formed by this process is the Grand Canyon of Arizona. North and east of the Grand Canyon was a huge lake that I identified in 1988 and named Grand Lake. Its dumping released more water than is in all 5 of the Great Lakes. Grand Lake spilled over its rim and carved this spectacular funnel 20 miles south of Page, Arizona, catastrophically forming the Grand Canyon within a few weeks and leaving a living testament to this terrible global flood, which can now be studied in person today.
Well, so that's a very quick overview. And that probably itself brings a lot of questions, but we're not going to take any time with that because we're going to move on. And in the past, in communicating about asteroids, TNOs, comets coming from the Earth, some people get the impression, Kevin, what are you saying, that an asteroid just got jettisoned from the Earth? Did Pluto, a trans-Neptunian object now, used to be a planet, now it's ruled as a dwarf planet, and actually it's a trans-Neptunian object. It spends part of its orbit outside of Neptune, part inside, so it's called a TNO. And this asteroid, Ida, did the Earth just jettison these things? No, it didn't. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I am trying to say is that when the fountains of the Great Deep burst up, all that debris that was on the cracked walls that sloughed off and fell into this hypersonic ejection of what had been supercritical water that turned all of its thermal energy into kinetic energy and reaching speeds of greater than 7 miles a second, which is the escape velocity of the Earth, entrained this debris and launched it straight up, escape velocity from Earth, which means that it's going to go up, leave Earth's sphere of influence of its gravity, and then fall into an elliptical orbit around the sun. The sun will be taking over as the predominant gravity force if you eject something at 7 miles a second or greater. And so then these things went into elliptical orbits and congregated together. The debris that was shot in the same direction, same velocity, came together gravitationally and became the asteroids, comets, meteoroids, and trans-Neptunian objects that are floating through. So 3% of Earth's mass in the form of water, rock, debris was ejected into space, is what Dr. Brown has calculated, that's the total mass, and it had been 3%. Some of Earth's atmosphere would have been jettisoned also, and this is very important, because imagine when that crack ruptured, that supersonic jet of steam that was cooling off as it went up because of the depressurization from 60 miles underneath, it would have taken the atmosphere above the Earth and jettisoned it from the Earth. Now, how many of your speakers have talked about how it looks like the pre-flood Earth had a higher atmospheric pressure than the post-flood? Have you heard that in any of your presentations? There's only one scientific flood explanation that it can explain where the atmosphere went. Why did the atmosphere become less? Because it got jettisoned from the Earth and it went off into space, and it congregated along with the debris to become frozen lakes of carbon dioxide, liquid nitrogen, frozen oxygen on Pluto. Pluto has a bunch of Earth's atmosphere in it. That blew scientists away. They found a frozen lake of carbon monoxide on Pluto, and they can't explain it. So Earth lost some of its atmosphere, and the rocks, debris, water, and gases gravitationally concentrated to become the asteroids, comets, and TNOs that we see in space today. Now, for those of you that followed the news here a couple years ago, the Europeans landed a probe, for the first time successfully landed a probe on the 67P comet. It was a ingenious, they had 10 years of using gravitational acceleration of planets to bring this probe out to catch up with this comet and land on it. It was really successful, except for the fact the lander hit perfect target on the comet, but because its gravity was so low and its anchors that were supposed to fire in didn't quite do the job, and so it bounced off of the 67P comet and then hit again, bounced off, and hit again, and shielded its solar panels by where it landed in the crater. And so they only had the battery life of a few hours to take the pictures that we now have of the comet and to find, guess what? Left-handed amino acid glycine, along with everything else that they found, and that was national news 2 weeks ago. They took this long. They took from this time, again, to delay to say we know that there is glycine that was found on 67P. So among the other things they found on 67P, besides the left-handed amino acid glycine, they found 15 organic compounds. Shocking. Complex organic compounds found on 67P, methane, other things. You can read Dr. Brown's asteroid chapter over there. And this is what it would look like if it sat on LA. And so this is all digital, this is digital recreated Comet 67P and how it would size up to LA. If you were to stick it in a bathtub, half of it would stay out of the bathtub because it's so light, it's so empty on the inside. Also very shocking to them. How did this fluffy thing all come together? Well, that's exactly what you'd expect. If you blew a bunch of debris in one direction, one velocity, it all got away from Earth's gravity, far out in the solar system gravity, came together. And what you'll notice is, see this, and I want to emphasize this here. See this body here? And then you see this here. They call it a duck, by the way. They want to say that this is their rubber ducky, and this is the head of it. And this is a very typical, and you'll see it in the other pictures of asteroids, it's typical that it looks like these things used to be two bodies that came together. And they say, but how? That's not possible, because if you understand orbital physics, two things don't want to come together in space. Even if you, just like that bounce off situation, you have a very difficult time getting this orbital body to come together with this orbital body. When we have an orbital spaceship that we want to land back down on Earth, what do we have to do? We have to light off a rocket that opposes its direction of travel to slow it down so that it can come back down on Earth. Well, this side of the comet doesn't have retro rockets. This doesn't have retro rockets. How did this happen? Dr. Brown's hydroplate theory explains how it happened. We'll see that. And we're going to see that in Brian Nichols' DVD. This is taken from part 2 of his online presentation of the hydroplate theory. And I've queued it up to the very end of this one because his animation is worth 1,000 words, thousands of words actually. And so we're going to be lighting this off.
Of course, without question, the Earth's surface has the highest known concentrations of these familiar products of life. Where else does something like cellulose form and thrive? Often these bodies are explained as leftover building blocks of our Earth. So while there is much speculation over the origin of these objects and their content of trace organics, the evidence strongly suggests that we are standing on the source. Although rather large, asteroids like comets have low density and are weakly held together. Vesta is one of the largest and is almost big enough for its gravity to make it spherical. Ceres is the largest asteroid and makes up 1/3 of the mass of all asteroids combined. It has just enough mass to pull itself into a roughly spherical shape. The mass of all known asteroids combined make up only a small percentage of Earth's mass. So asteroids are probably not the fragments of a planet that completely exploded, as some people initially thought. Since asteroids are actually made up of many smaller rocks, dust, and water ice, it is not so hard to imagine them being ejected from Earth via mechanisms we just covered. As these particles traveled farther from Earth, their gravitational sphere of influence increased, so larger rocks gravitationally attracted more and more smaller rocks into their vicinity, which caused their gravitational spheres of influence to grow even more. Eventually, these mergings became comets and asteroids. Those that did not merge to become comets and asteroids are today's meteoroids. Some asteroids became so large that they maintained their gaseous atmospheres for much longer, which allowed them to sail on the solar wind past Neptune's orbit, becoming trans-Neptunian objects or TNOs. TNOs share many characteristics with asteroids. Both measure exceptionally low densities of around 2 grams per cubic centimeter. Both are often reddish in color due to the surface rocks containing iron oxide, oxides which likely formed due to the presence of water launched with the rocks in the fountains of the deep. When the mass of all TNOs is considered, then the percentage of the material ejected from the flood jumps to around 3% of Earth's mass. This line of evidence is one of the main reasons for changing hydroplate theory's estimated initial crust thickness to 60 miles. I say special conditions are required to form these objects because the gravity of small objects is tiny. Asteroids and comets would never accrete if the trajectories of objects and the angles of impact were random. Even landing a small, carefully guided space probe on a large asteroid or comet is incredibly challenging due to how low the gravity environment is. If traveling at even slightly differing speeds, impacts in space result in further fragmentation and breakup of particles, which will never return to each other. Just so conditions are required for accretion. All of these special conditions are accounted for and explained by the hydroplate theory. Items must be traveling at the same relative speeds and along the same trajectory. The presence of gases during this process greatly aids in aerobraking the inbound components, providing the best possible conditions for successful accretion. Many asteroids surprisingly have moons like Ida and its moon Dactyl. Capturing a moon is incredibly difficult for the same reasons we just discussed. However, moons would be expected if asteroids originated from a stream of particles with shared velocities and direction. Many TNOs have moons as well, as hydroplate theory would expect. Some TNOs even orbit each other at great distances. Another scenario which requires the unique conditions that only hydroplate theory seems to be able to provide. Some large asteroids have gently connected with their moon, like Itokawa. As stated, it is difficult to do this even with small, precisely controlled spacecraft. When the large size of these fragile bodies is considered, it is hard to imagine how this occurred randomly in space with no gaseous atmosphere to provide aerobraking. Notice that this picture of the surface matches what hydroplate theory predicts. Asteroids are not angular shards of a broken larger planetoid. They are low-density flying rock piles loosely held together by water ice. The rocks are well rounded. In this picture, some rounded boulders are over 150 feet in diameter. High-velocity flow produced many rounded objects discovered on Itokawa. Hydroplate theory readily explains these findings. Meanwhile, researchers like Donald Yeomans from NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory realize the problem and currently seem stumped by what is observed due to their evolutionary viewpoint. Recent detailed...
Yeah, it's worth reading this. It's a major mystery how two objects, each the size of skyscrapers, could collide without blowing each other to smithereens. Now, this is a professor. He's saying, how did this happen? This is especially puzzling in a region of the solar system where gravitational forces would normally involve collision speeds of 2 kilometers per second. 4,500 miles an hour is the typical speed in this area of the asteroid belt of system. How in the world did this come together to form this Itokawa asteroid? And they're befuddled. Once again, I'm telling you, the scientists just are shocked at what they see. What they see is not consistent with what they believe created them.
Recent detailed explanations show comets have similar makeup as asteroids. In fact, some asteroids are categorized as both an asteroid and a comet, since they sometimes vent gases and dust producing familiar tails. Comet comas like the one shown are low-density dirty snowballs composed primarily of water ice, dust, organics, and curiously again rounded boulders. The surface of Comet 67P has layer upon layer of large rounded boulders at least 10 feet in diameter. This would not be expected if these fragments were due to collisions in space. They should be jagged and angular. Of course, rounded boulders is exactly what is expected if these fragments were once exposed to and tumbled in an extremely high velocity flow as they were ejected from the fountains of the deep. This is the same mechanism by which river rocks are rounded, albeit these large, quote, dino eggs were rounded much faster. Here is an opening in the face of Comet 67P.
Okay, now he's going to say there's an opening in the face of Comet 67P, but he says this is where one of the dino eggs dislodged. That's not accurate. If you look at that impact area where something just went into this meringue pie and just punched a hole in it, what they see on the side of the wall are the dinosaur eggs, tens of thousands of them. So it's not a place where one came loose. Can you see it from your distance there? The wall looks like there are a bunch of rounded off rocks. The crater wall, near vertical crater wall, that the punch in lets you see it, and it's just full of these dinosaur eggs is what the scientists called them. So it's...
You better make that clear. Those are not real dinosaurs.
Right, yeah, right. They're calling them, see it says, Eric Hand said, that's what they're, because they rounded off. How did rock in space get rounded off, tens of thousands of them, and pile up inside this comet?
Here is an opening in the face of Comet 67P where one of the rounded eggs has dislodged. Here again, rounded boulders are observed on the peanut-shaped comet Hartley 2. Like the subject of the origin of Earth's radioactivity, the hydroplate theory's full explanation of the origin of comets, asteroids, meteors, and TNOs would take us on a long bunny trail that would distract from this overview, so we will have to leave this subject and move on.
So hopefully that's going to help. What's really key to that is if you jettison from Earth debris in one direction and one velocity, it will come together. In fact, if somebody could shoot you and your wife, or up into space, the analogy I use with the church, if they shot you up together in space and let's say you're 10 yards apart, there's nothing you can do to get to each other. There's nothing. In the absence of gravity in an atmosphere, you cannot come together, except as you get away from Earth's gravity, then your gravity will attract you. You'll be able to literally say, I'm attracted to you. And after a period of time, you would actually come together. You would, going through space, your gravity and your wife's gravity, in my case, would be pulling at each other, very small, because we're such a small mass, but we would actually be able to come together. And that's what happens to these rocks in space. And the atmosphere that would have been around it of water vapor, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, would have assisted in the aerobraking to bring you together. So meteorites, things that were launched into space and became meteoroids that landed on Earth and have been studied by man, everything that they have found about them, chondrules, salt crystals, water, limestone, DNA components of DNA, cellulose, what your trees are made out of, sugars, bacteria. They have found bacteria on meteorites. Terrestrial like brines, left-handed amino acids, heavy hydrogen, which is deuterium, Earth-like minerals, Earth-like isotopes. That's what they find. What does that all testify of? They came from Earth. It completely testifies that they came from Earth, but that's not possible. So they kind of try and come up with different reasons for why they found these things. 95% of the meteorites that have hit Earth are stones, 4% are irons, nickel, 1% are pallasites. Very befuddling to scientists. That's a pallasite meteorite. They took a several 100-pound meteorite and shaved a 22-pound off of it in a very thin piece so that this guy can hold up an iron nickel. The dark parts are iron nickel. And the shiny parts is the most common mineral in Earth's crust called olivine. And what's really shocking is olivine is half the density of iron nickel. And so how did this thing form where it would be the equivalent of freezing ping pong balls where they are all homogeneously mixed in water, in a water tub, rather than being all floated on the top, because ping pong balls shouldn't be able to be in the water. So I was going to originally explain how all that happened, but I realized it's going to take too long. So you can get the information from Dr. Walt Brown's book for how that occurred. So let's go to where did the energy come from to melt these metals, rocks, and crystals together? And where did the energy come from to launch debris from Earth, which then became meteoroids, comets, asteroids, and trans-Neptunian objects? Two important questions. And this is the pre-flood Earth. Again, this is out of Walt Brown's book. This is a figure out of Walt Brown's book. You have the subterranean water that was created that way. The water, the ocean of water underneath the crust of the Earth was an at creation assumption, the only assumption of the hydroplate theory. And what we have is the crust is now 60 miles thick. Right now, the average thickness is about 30 miles thick, and that's because the subterranean chamber ceiling, which is the crust bottom, 30 miles of it went out the fountains of the Great Deep, busted up, and became the fountains of the Great Deep to become the mass, the 3% of Earth's mass that went on to go become comets, asteroid, and trans-Neptunian objects. And so now that's 60 miles thick. That became 30. And through lunar, we know that the moon gives tides in our oceans, right? Well, the ocean underneath the crust would have been, it's another ocean. And the moon would have tidally pumped that ocean to move the water in the subterranean chamber twice a day and lift the crust up and lower the crust down twice a day. There would have been that action, and that would have heated up the water in the subterranean chamber. As soon as you get to 705 degrees and above water temperature, water changes state to what's called supercritical. It's not water, it's not liquid or steam or solid like ice. It goes to a fourth state of water called supercritical water, where if you could look through the vessel and see temperature, water at 710 degrees, let's say, you would not see a water-steam interface. It would just be nothing but little microscopic particles of liquid water turning to steam and back, running into each other with extreme velocity. And what I've said before is that because those molecules of water have so much thermal energy in them, they are traveling so fast, they have the ability to dissolve minerals and things. It's an extremely powerful dissolving agent. And so now, as soon as the water in the subterranean chamber got to that temperature, it's dissolving the mantle floor, or the floor of the subterranean chamber, the mantle, and it's dissolving into the crust. And if you were to have, if there was a vessel that could contain this, and this water was at 710 degrees, supercritical water, if I somehow could just get everybody out of here and blow the lid on it, the entire contents of that supercritical water would turn all of its thermal energy into kinetic energy and would be equivalent to a stick of dynamite. Now imagine supercritical water, billions of gallons of water in the subterranean chamber that's been pumped up to supercritical water temperature, and release that from hundreds of thousands of pounds per square inch, 60 miles below the crust, and you would have an unimaginable explosive energy that would be jettisoning the crack walls that were sloughing off and going into that and train explosive energy. So now we're going to look at the pillars, and this is how the pumping action heated up. And if you look at this, you'll see that as the tidal pumping of the moon goes by, it's pumping, most of the pressure that's holding up the crust is the water pressure, but there's pillars, thousands, tens of thousands of pillars all over the circumference of the Earth where the crust has come down to touch the mantle. And so the heating action of the pillar and the heating of the water, when the water reaches supercritical temperature, it turns the crust porous and brittle. Brian Nichols has not updated this to show that it would have also dissolved the mantle, but it would have. Iron nickel would come out of the granite and form down into the pillar bottom. The pillars would have broke off during the flood, and that's where the iron and nickel, molten iron and nickel, was jettisoned and combined with olivine, the crustal mineral, to become pallasites. And after the rupture, so then that pressure builds up, something happened to create a crustal crack. As soon as the pressure goes lower, the explosive energy is happening, and that would have caused the crust to flutter, because the water's flowing under the crust, and just like air flowing over a flag blows the flag, the crust would have been fluttering horizontally. And when it did so, there would have been electrical charges created in the granite crust, which has piezoelectric crystals and other things, and that would have, and this is part of Dr. Brown's theory too. There's a chapter called The Origin of Earth's Radioactivity, reproducible in the lab, if you give extreme voltage and currents concentrated into an item, it goes into what's called a plasma state and will create superfusion of atoms and subsequent fissioning of atoms, where a copper electrode, this is Ukrainian scientists, a copper electrode with inside the vial where this happened, what they find inside that chamber afterwards is every element of the periodic table. So in other words, copper through a plasma electrical field explodes and creates, forces through Z-pinch atoms to come so close together that they superfusion, then fission into the elements of the periodic table, releasing heat and neutrons. And that's what further heated the water in the subterranean chamber, and it is the source of this nuclear energy going into the subterranean chamber waters that heated up the water to supercritical and sent billions of gallons of water, supercritical water, out the chamber. That is where the energy comes from to launch this. In fact, that's what I admitted to Dr. Brownlee. I said, Dr. Brownlee, I know it's preposterous to think that something on Earth could jettison the material from the crust up into space. I acknowledge that. But Dr. Brown does have a scientific explanation for how that could occur. And if you accept that, then everything else falls into place. This stuff came from the Earth. In the Flood Science Review, which was done by Ingie's Name Productions, they funded and set the rules up to do a flood science review with the different flood theories. Dr. John Baumgartner, who is the head guy on the catastrophic plate, in his catastrophic plate tectonic theory, which is a competing theory to the hydroplate theory, he wrote the following in his critique of Dr. Brown's assertion that electrically induced nuclear heat processes occurred in the crust by saying, in granite, however, the quartz crystals are oriented randomly. This ought to represent a fatal problem for Brown's claim that such extreme voltages will essentially arise automatically. He says, he goes on to, but you know, this is impossible, but let's say it's possible. This part of his explanation is impossible, but let's say that's part true, and he keeps rattling on with his rebuttals to Dr. Brown's work. Well, let's take just that one, and you can do the same thing for all of his other critiques. And I reference you to my friend Bob Enyart's website. He's out of Colorado. He's a very strong apologist for young Earth creationism, creation science. And his website has the best source on soft tissue for dinosaurs, the best source for carbon-14 being found every place it's not supposed to be found. And at kdub.com, he has one section called List of Answers to Hydroplate Objections, where he takes these objections from people and answers them. And he says, smoking gun is that it actually does happen. They know the crust being stressed creates electrical currents. And how do we know? Well, National Geographic, no friend to Walt Brown hydroplate theory creation science, writes that they know that by scientific discovery that in a 6-point earthquake, 100,000 amps and higher of electrical current are going through the crust. If you take it to a 7 magnitude, it's 1,000,000 amps. It's like lightning bolts through the crust of the Earth. Also, one of the other things that Dr. Baumgartner said is Walt has provided no evidence that this actually occurs. Well, when I read that, I go, man, he should have read Dr. Brown's book, because in the published 8th edition, it has multiple examples of, during major earthquakes, eyewitnesses, wow, our ship was moored out, was anchored out at sea outside the Chile's earthquake, and our anchor chain was glowing red hot during the earthquake. And we saw lightning bolts that were shooting from the ground up into space. We saw these things, and so he gives all these eyewitness testimonies along with stuff that happened in the New Madrid earthquake of years ago. And one of my favorite ones is all the recent major earthquakes. Space probes that are looking at the ionosphere from space, not because of earthquake prediction, but just monitoring the ionosphere, have picked up when Haiti had its quake, China had its quake, and Japan had its quake. They noticed that just before the earthquake, there was a concentration of energy, ion energy, that perturbed the ionosphere right above the epicenter just before the quake happened. The conspiracy people are saying that the HAARP antenna up in Alaska was being used as a military weapon to cause earthquakes. They were saying, well, the HAARP antenna, which messes with the ionosphere too, created the earthquake. No, no, no. It was the earthquake just before the crust failed in the load that it had on it, stressed and was creating these electrical charges and voltages and currents down deep, and that was concentrating the ions in the ionosphere, and these space probes are picking it up to the point where now people are realizing, no, it wasn't HAARP. This is a way to predict earthquakes, and there's a lot of work going into predicting earthquakes as associated because of this phenomenon that happens. So again, for and by the way, Bob Enyart has sent Dr. Baumgartner those lists of things and all the documentation to support it. If you go to his site, you get all the documentation supporting those things, and he hasn't heard back from Dr. Baumgartner. So to me, the way I look at it is like somebody, you know, Wright brothers, 1903? 1903, the Wright brothers flew. 1901, 1902, people were saying, things heavier than air can't fly. There's no way anything heavier than air is going to fly. But it's kind of dumb to say that in 1905, don't you think? Because they had done it. So you can't say, Dr. Brown's got a fatal flaw. There's no way there's the energy that can do this because it can happen. Well, it actually is happening. It's been documented. It's been seen. So comets, asteroids, TNOs, so now we're going to learn a little bit about orbital issues here. Space launch platform, and you'll notice that as soon as we launch up, what does that missile want to do? It wants to tip over because it's wanting to achieve a circular orbit around the Earth. So if you don't give it enough thrust, it's going to fall to Earth and crash, but as soon as you give it enough thrust, it goes into a circular orbit around the Earth. It's falling at the same pace that the Earth is disappearing under it. So really all a spacecraft is doing is it just goes into a forever falling. But it never runs into anything because of that relationship of gravity in the dragless area of space above our atmosphere. Low Earth orbit velocity equals about 4.8 miles a second. If you get that going 4.8 miles a second in relation to the Earth, it'll go into orbit above the atmosphere, so the atmosphere won't slow it down. But if you were to put it up in orbit where the atmosphere is, what would happen to it? It would slow down, burn, and crash. And so that's important because if there's any atmosphere that's something that's orbiting and it wants to slow down and come into and crash onto the thing that it was orbiting. And that's what happens in space. If you have you're jettisoning a bunch of rocks, and so this big rock gets its little pile going, this big rock gets its little pile going, and then the gravity causes this smaller one to go around, but it's hitting the atmosphere of water molecules and nitrogen and oxygen, and slows down and crashes and turns into the asteroid and comet view of two bodies that look like they came together. Does everybody follow that? Follow that, okay? So if you want to escape Earth's velocity, like I said before, you point that cannon straight up. You don't point it orbitally. You point it straight up. You give it 7 miles a second velocity, and that body will go all the way up, and it's almost ready to come back down to Earth, but then sun's gravity takes over, and it swings and starts wrapping around in elliptical orbits around the sun. So it escapes Earth's gravity at a launch speed at Earth's surface of 7 miles a second. And it'll leave and it'll go into an elliptical orbit. And these are the orbits of our comets today. They're in elliptical orbits around the sun. Our asteroids started out in elliptical orbits, but now they're in a circular orbit in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, and we're going to explain why. So this is something that got jettisoned from Earth. It goes up, and when it gets to the aphelion, farthest away from the sun, it's at walking speed. You could You can keep up with it. It's walking, and then it comes and races back in. That's what we see comets do. Comets go way out, spend years and years way out there, and then they come in and travel at many, many miles a second, depending on, and so if it goes a little bit faster, the parabolic orbit is any faster than the parabolic orbit, and you are going to never come back to the sun. So when you're at a speed of parabolic, it's just barely coming back. And there are many near parabolic comet orbits. And if you read Dr. Brown's comet chapter, you'll see the importance of that. And if you go a little bit faster, you will go hyperbolic, meaning that comet will never come back. It goes outside of the sun's sphere of influence, and it will. And so the origin of the asteroid belt, what we see here, all those white dots and the green dots over by the Greeks and the green dots over by the Trojans, those are all asteroids. Thousands and thousands of asteroids that are in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. And so the next slide is showing how did something ejected from Earth that went into an elliptical orbit, how did that end up, if we're saying asteroids came from the ejected material from Earth, and everything ejected is going to go into an elliptical orbit. It's not going to go into a circular orbit around the sun, because that's not the trajectory that you can accomplish. So how did it get that way? Since that's the asteroid belt orbiting, and it's, by the way, it's all in the plane. Those asteroids are all in the plane of the solar system. How did the orbits go from elliptical to circular? And the answer is that at first the debris was spread throughout the solar system, because that crack is throwing debris all over. Atmosphere, water, debris, rock, leftover trees. By the way, they probably won't ever find a tree root, but they could very easily, because the energy, we're in the area of Mount St. Helens, right? When that sucker blew, what did it do? I mean, it turned the trees that were on the top 1,200 feet of Mount St. Helens and turned them into nothing but just atoms floating around with the pyroplastic flow of the... By the way, you know what the energy was to blow that top of the lid off? It was supercritical water. It was the water that was still left over from the flood. It had come up through the magma chambers that was underneath the crust, and it was being contained by the crust until it breaks, and that's why they have a hard time understanding how does water get into the magma that becomes these pyroplastic flows and volcanoes that blow up. Because it can't be groundwater that goes down into a super high pressure magma chamber, because groundwater isn't going to get to the chamber. It's leftover water from the fountains of the great deep. So anyway, how does it go from this down to this? And the answers are a radiometer effect. This is a almost evacuated tube with just veins painted black on one side, white on the other side. And if you shine a flashlight on it, the photons heat up the black side more than the white side and causes the vein to rotate. So that's why the asteroids that are farthest down in the asteroid belt are darker than the ones that are inside. The sun's radiation, its photons being focused into these objects, will give them a thrust on the dark side or the hot side. And solar wind and the Carnot effect, and this is really important because it is the Carnot engine effect that is what drives the TNOs out past the orbit of Neptune and interstellar debris. So here's the solar sail. Each one of these items is trying to come to the center of gravity of this bursted blast that went out into space, and the sun is tugging on it the other way, but there's also a this acts as a sail that when the photons from the sun are hitting each one of those objects, whether it's molecules of atmosphere or rocks or debris, it's giving a thrust and sending those things further out into orbit. Now remember, it's elliptical, but during the elliptical orbit, I lost my ellipse here. So during the elliptical orbit around the sun, when the item is here and the sun's here, it's closer. And so the sun is going to be able to have a greater thrust on the asteroid when it's closest to it, and it's going to have a thrusting out, and it's going to circularize this elliptical orbit. It's going to have a tendency to circularize the orbit. And then this is also very important, and that is that the asteroid, when it comes together, all those rocks are rotating at various different speeds, and when it comes together, the combined rotation is the exact equivalent of all of those put together, the conservation of angular momentum. The thing is going to spin. And it's got atmosphere. But it's atmosphere out in minus 400 degrees on the cold side of the asteroid. And so you're going to have oxygen that's going to liquefy. You're going to have nitrogen liquefying. You're going to have water turning into ice. You're going to have carbon dioxide turning into dry ice on the dark side. And there's not going to be atmosphere there. But as soon as that asteroid turns around and faces the sun, all of those now frozen liquefied gases are going to reappear as molecules of gas, and that's going to give a thrusting effect of atmosphere on that swirling asteroid. So it's turning in that direction. We're going to call it same orbital speed as the Earth, so we'll say 12 noon. And see, we know the afternoon is hotter than actual noon. And the same is true on an asteroid. And so notice the size of these atmospheric thrusting forces are greater than on the cold side where all the atmosphere is condensing onto the asteroid surface. Does everybody understand that? So what you're having is a thrust. The atmosphere itself is going to be thrusting on this asteroid because the atmosphere on this side of the asteroid is greater than the atmosphere on the other side. This doesn't happen on Earth because all of our atmosphere doesn't all condense on the cold side of our Earth. And so then you have a thrusting vector that is broken down by engineering physics, and JD can chime in if he ever thinks any of this stuff is hocus pocus as an engineer. And that thrust vector breaks into two, one that's going to increase the angular momentum, the other that's going to increase the orbit radius. And so as this asteroid is traveling, it's going to be thrust out into a further and further orbit until it gets to the point where its atmosphere has run out because the solar wind has blown all the atmosphere off, or because it gets so cold that the atmosphere is no longer putting a thrusting force because it's all staying liquid because it's so far out into the asteroid belt. And that's why they've congregated into the asteroid belt. Now, and I'm going to just blow through these in the interest of time. I was going to explain the drag effect. You're going to have to just kind of take this engineer, Brian Nichols, word for it, along with reading Dr. Brown's. But this is the view. Here's the Earth going around, ruptured. It's got a big rupture on it, and it spits out a debris field, gases and rock. And now we're going to go look and see that highly elliptical orbit runs into the drag when it comes. It slows down. It's going to change the angle of inclination in over several orbits. It's going to find itself circularizing into the plane of the solar system and in the asteroid belt. So if you look at the origin of the asteroid belt, first of all, there was debris from the flood that went into the inner solar system. And, oops, I meant to do it just a second. And then see that elliptical orbit? This is what would have happened to those asteroids. And Dr. Brown has put in very reasonable assumptions. He blew debris all over in the solar system, all different directions, all different angles of inclination, gave very reasonable assumptions on these thrusting effects that are known to science, and then told the computer what's going to happen. And all those different pieces of debris all coalesced into the asteroid belt of today by computer simulation, assuming they had an atmosphere around them. Okay, now, but all these asteroids have, over a period of time, because the solar wind would have blown all the atmosphere away, and the atmosphere going away made those asteroids run out of gas. They were being thrusted out, now circularized and ran out of gas, and so that's why they're staying where they are. So now what's the origin of TNOs? Trans-Neptunian objects. So now we're looking out, we're seeing that the orbit of Jupiter. And so here's an asteroid, small debris pile. Can't hold on to much atmosphere, loses its atmosphere, falls into this permanent place in our solar system in the asteroid belt. But what about the huge pulses? What about when there was some major water hammer issue, probably early on in the rupture of the flood, that when the crust came down and touched the mantle floor, and all that billions of gallons was rushing to that crack but got stopped all of a sudden. And then it just exploded with such energy that it just threw a huge debris pile up into space. It has a lot more atmosphere with it, a lot more water with it, a lot more velocity, and so it goes out to become a TNO. So again, here's what happens. The TNO is bigger. Pluto was bigger. It had more debris, had more atmosphere. It keeps on going until it gets so far out there that it runs out of gas itself. And we know where Pluto ran out. It's where it is today. Now, the most well-known TNO is Pluto. Notice the red color on the bottom right there? Rusted iron oxide. Kind of shocking. See that white area in the middle? You know what that is? That is a lake of frozen carbon monoxide. Shock. They would not have predicted that they would find carbon monoxide. Where does carbon monoxide come from? It comes from incomplete oxygen content in the burning of carbon-based products. You know, when you're burning fossil fuel and you don't have enough oxygen, then you get carbon monoxide instead of carbon dioxide. And so these impacts and things that were happening to this debris pile that was going on, including trees and vegetation and everything else, all this organic stuff was being burned in a oxygen poor atmosphere, creating carbon monoxide that stays with it while it's going through. And see, while it's closer to the sun, the carbon monoxide is liquid. It rains. It comes up from all the burning happening with the internal heat of Pluto that came together and accreted together, and these impacts that would have been happening. And so then it rains carbon monoxide that falls into a low place, and then the comet or the TNO keeps on going further out, and all of a sudden now the lake freezes. And it's no longer in atmosphere to give it further thrusting, and it's now found as a carbon monoxide lake on Pluto. And that's why does Pluto, the largest known TNO, have a frozen lake of carbon monoxide. And those are the contours of the concentration of that lake. Why does Pluto have 11,000 foot high mountains of water ice? And they were shocked by this. How in the world? And Jeff Moore of the New Horizons Geology, Geophysics, and Imaging team said this is one of the youngest surfaces we've ever seen in the solar system. In fact, it's about 5,000 years old at the time of the flood. And shocking, they could not believe what they were seeing. More surprising was that when they looked through the sphere, they see there's atmosphere still leaving this Pluto. Pluto has an atmosphere. And it's being stripped away at 500 tons an hour. How could this thing be billions of years old? Any atmosphere would have been swept away a long time ago. Because it's not billions of years old. It's not been around since the Big Bang. It was created 5,000 years ago when the Earth jettisoned this stuff into space, and Earth lost some of its atmosphere. And it's with Pluto. The very simple explanation is the hydroplate theory explanation for where they came from, with all the other data that supports it. You know, amino acids, bacteria, olivine, all these other things, all the data coming in that these things were launched from the Earth, and they ignore that. And so, in summary, scientific discovery about comets, asteroids, TNOs are inconsistent with the Big Bang paradigm. I'm going to finish this and then we're going to go right to questions. Some discoveries are so shocking to scientists that they admit they have no explanation for the observed data. And I've had one tell me that over the phone. I watched one of them tell hundreds of people at the University of Washington auditorium. I can't tell you what the explanation is, don't know when I can. All discoveries are easily and scientifically explained by the hydroplate theory premise that they originated from the ejected mass of the Earth when the fountains erupted. And my final summary not on here is I really wish I had the time and could remove a few years of age to go back to college, take astronomy classes, and go in and talk to the professor, be one of the students in the class, but professor, what about? What about, what about, what about? And the real agony to me is that if AIG and ICR were to at least not blackball Dr. Brown's work, to cover it, to point people to it, their children could be equipped. As Ken Ham has said many, many times, I've been in the auditorium when he says, if we don't have answers from Genesis, if we send our kids off to college and then the evolutionists are going to mess their brain up and we have the answers. Well, see, the coolest thing about astronomy is its gravity and mathematics. It's just those two things. There isn't like a strata layer and arguing over whether a polystrat fossil was, this many millions of years. It's gravity and math. And that is a huge argument. And it all came from the flood of Noah. And I hope that you can tell others, and we're going to put this on YouTube so that people can go to school, they can read the asteroid chapter, read the comet chapter, go and make the professors wish that they had several days off, that they had retired early, because they have no answers for this stuff, and there is an answer. It's from the Bible. It says that there was a flood one day, and it was a powerful flood. Amen.
Okay, if you have any questions, please, there's one back there, Dan, to the left.
Yes, sir. And you have it. Just say.
Well, a lot of the very interesting things. I would like to have some data that I can take in my hand and show it to some mathematician. And where they prove or disprove whether Pluto could be put in orbit. That's what you have suggested.
Right.
From the squirting up of the water from the Earth. And I'd like to have that in paper, in mathematics.
Right. Yeah.
Now, second thing I want to mention, you said the only assumption that Dr. Brown makes is that there was water trapped underneath the mass of the Earth.
Right.
Well, I'd like to question that by saying, look, we have no evidence of fountains of the caverns that they're supposed to have been there. But when we talk about fountains of the great deep, we have billions, many evidences of volcanic fountains. A volcano is a fountain, and it comes from the great deep. And the book of Amos even tells us about a fountain from the great deep that God was contemplating to judge the earth with, and he decided not to do it. But it talks about from the great deep, the fountain that fire rolled floating over the surface of the earth as a judgment from God. That never happened, but that was what God was contemplating. So I say the fountains of the great deep, you ought to be able to see evidence. And if you look at volcanoes, including the flood basalts like came from eastern Washington, that's a fountain. There are fountains everywhere, all around the world, that make a lot more sense than a water fountain, in my judgment.
Okay.
So anyway, the main thing is I want some arithmetic. We can
Okay.
bring to scientists and say, could you orbit Pluto from a squirt in the Earth? I don't think it could.
Okay. Well, first of all, if you send debris into space and it leaves Earth's gravitational attraction, the question was, how could Pluto have truly accelerated? I want to see the math associated with that happening. If the debris leaves Earth with escape velocity, it will go into elliptical orbit around the sun.
Yeah,
we know it has an atmosphere. And we know that atmosphere consisted of what would have been volatile atmosphere, closer to the sun of nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water. So we know that. And we also know by physics that if, as soon as it goes into an elliptical orbit around the sun, there would have been a thrusting force of that atmosphere placed on that. Now, if something's in orbit and you thrust it, it's going to keep going out until it runs out of gas to thrust. So that's just, it's going to happen. If that, so the only question is, did that debris associated with Pluto truly get ejected from the Earth? If that's in doubt, that you can say, okay, that didn't happen. But if it did, the atmosphere is there and it's got thrust. It's got a Carnot engine. And that the terminology that was used in this PowerPoint program is the scientist who talks about this is a Carnot engine that works in space. This is a process that will work in space to accelerate things in space. Now, about no evidence, the other question is, there's no evidence that there was water underneath the crust. Well, actually there is. They have done conductivity measurements underneath the plateaus of the Earth, and every single plateau that has been measured, and I think they're up to all of them now, there is a huge pool of aqueous brine solution underneath, miles underneath the crust. They tried to do deep drilling projects. They wanted to find the mantle. The Germans did it and the Russians did it. And they drilled deep and deep down, miles and miles, and they came with crushed granite and salt water. Too deep to have come from surface water. The fact that volcanoes have water coming up from them is also a testimony that there was at one time water deep, because you're not going to get surface rainwater going that deep. And then about volcanoes being the fountains of the great deep, that volcanoes don't create 40 days and 40 nights of global rainfall. The terminology being used in Genesis is indicative of the fountains of the great deep burst up in one day, and the windows of heaven opened up, and it rained 40 days and 40 nights. Now, the windows of heaven popularized the canopy theory, but what God was saying is the fountains left earth of water, and then the water came down from the windows of heaven and buried the mammoths. There was, read Dr. Brown's mammoth chapter. I mean, a mammoth frozen, standing up, his forearm broken in 12 places without any damage to his arm on the outside. There was rain coming down, and he got a rain of carbon dioxide and super frozen water that didn't leave Earth. It went up into space, got frozen, turned into 400 degree below zero water that came down and dumped in places and completely buried and crushed this mammoth and put it into the permafrost. And then the Earth rolled and sent it up in Siberia, and they found it in the early 1900s. It's the Burkova mammoth, and read about that in the mammoth chapter. So there is plenty of evidence that there was water underneath the crust, was jettisoned up into space, caused 40 days and 40 nights of rain, and some of it came down from the windows of heaven to be frozen and to bury the mammoths and other things that are found. They just found some little dogs in the Siberian permafrost a couple of weeks ago, and they're befuddled by that too. Sir, well, actually, I'm over here first. He was the first guy.
What he just said.
Okay, just a second, but I'm going to give this gentleman because he was first. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, I understand.
But and actually, I'm going to interrupt for just a second because JD told me you're free to go if you have to go, because I am over the time. So you're free. I won't be offended, but I'm going to stay here until all the questions are answered. Go ahead.
As I understand, all these objects are flying around the sun.
Yeah.
What keeps the sun in place?
Well, I mean, if you go to the privilege, it's God that put the whole thing, and there's people that have written on how our solar system is in a way, it's in the very center of God's creation of the universe. And it's really, God created it that way. Just like Job says that the earth is held up by nothing. It's just, and now we know that that's true. It's held up by the gravitational force. So, any other, yeah?
One thing that keeps the sun in place is God.
Yeah, amen. God keeps it. Yeah, and now I'm going to go.
I just wanted to add to what you're saying.
Yeah.
I heard a geophysicist saying that there is now 10 times as much water under the surface of the earth as there is on the earth.
Yeah, that's based on, and it's actually the hydroxyl, the hydroxyl molecule is OH instead of H2O. It's locked into the chemical structure, and recently there's been some interest in saying that's where the water comes. Well, no, it has to go find the hydrogen to become actual water, because the catastrophic plate is trying to come up with a source of the fountains. Because they get asked all the time, where did the water come from to flood the entire Earth at one time to 20 feet? And so they're trying to come up with these hydroxyl atoms that are locked into the matrix structure of the mantle. Yeah. So go ahead.
But even today, there's significant amounts of water in the Earth's crust. They drill for groundwater all the time.
Oh, I know, but see, that's groundwater. But see,
There's a significant amount of water captured.
yeah, but see, these deep drilling projects went below 5 miles.
I
Now,
know what you're telling me, but I'm saying that this is just an example. Near the surface, there's a tremendous amount of water.
yeah, but see, if it's rainwater that's gone down deep, found a place to go through fissures in the crust and stuff, that doesn't say, that's not answering the question where the water comes. But see, at 5 miles deep, there's such pressure on granite crust, you exceed the compressive strength of granite, it turns into putty, and there is not even a microscopic place for water to flow. So there should be zero water below 5 miles. Both of the deep drilling projects went below 5 miles, and they found hot, salt water and crushed granite. So there is evidence that there was water under the crust. And here's another one. And I said this during the earthquake video. Remember the Denali earthquake many years ago up in Alaska? Big, huge earthquake up in Denali, Alaska. In the Seattle area, Lake Union. Lake Union that night, local news, I have video of it here on my computer. Local news goes, whoa, what happened? These houseboats on Lake Union, right there in Seattle, they shook away from their moorings and ripped out their sewer lines and everything, and people were just saying, well, all of a sudden the lake just went crazy. And they attributed it to the exact timing of the Denali earthquake. The same thing happened at Lake Pontchartrain down in Louisiana. Mooring lines were being snapped on yachts on Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana. I talked to a guy who was there at the time, and he said, Kevin, it was like somebody took the lake and just went, just shook it up. They knew that that was from the Denali earthquake. Now, that means that there was a hydraulic coupling between Alaska and New Orleans. There was a hydraulic coupling between Alaska and Washington State. Because you punched in Alaska, and you're not, there weren't lakes between Alaska and Lake Union that were completely overflowing with things. They were fine because there wasn't a weak spot in the crust. So as the pressure was pushed onto this liquid layer that's still underneath the crust and pushed, it was putting a pressure pulse underneath all of America, and wherever there was a weak place, Lake Union in the Seattle area, Lake Pontchartrain down in New Orleans, it punches just like the slave cylinders on your car, that you push the pedal down and you get movement on your brake cylinders to slow you down. So there's plenty of evidence that there's water, liquid, underneath the crust. So, any other questions before we...
Right here?
Yeah. Yes?
Fascinating thing was watching, baseball scenes, these huge ocean trenches,
Right.
And how the split apart. That was a great, little diagram, on the screen. When does that fit into the flood narrative? You said it happened in one day, approximately?
Well, no, okay, so...
At the beginning of the flood narrative?
Somebody wrote that thing down for me. It's got a couple of pieces of masking tape in the corners, and just lifted off the TV there. So, okay, so let me make sure I understand your question. You're saying, when did the seams of the baseball, the mid-oceanic ridge, which is 46,000 miles, when did it form? Is that what you're asking?
What I'm saying is, this huge shift probably, happened during the flood, or was caused by the flood, or was caused by this explosion. But when did that happen during the flood narrative? How does that work into the flood narrative, the timing of the big shift of comets?
That was at the very end of the flood phase.
The very end.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. When all the water was covering all the mountains, which were much lower, the Himalayas weren't there. The Himalayas were a result of the compression event. The Himalayas, Rocky Mountains, Cascade Mountain Range, etc., weren't there. And so when the crack along this entire 46,000-mile mid-oceanic ridge, what is now the mid-oceanic ridge, when that crack widened to the point where the mantle bowed up because there was no longer crust on top of it, and there would have been a movement of the mantle which would have caused the South American continent to move away from it, and Europe and Africa to move to the east. At that moment, it's moving these continental plates that didn't have the mountain ranges, and when they came to a stop, that's when the train wreck piled up. That's when the crust piled up in one day. In fact, just a few hours. And you can see the example of that. If you go to Dr. Brown's book, there's a picture of a mountain range just north of us up in Canada that just shows the way God left the mountain. You can see the folded sedimentary layers that were laid down horizontally, and you can tell it all just got crushed together, just like they took a phone book and took the two sides and you give it a fold. And you can see those folds everywhere. You can see them on the side of the road where they blasted through for a road. When Ade and I were down in the San Diego area, went to a gold mine down there, and you're inside the sedimentary rock of a gold mine, and you see these folds that are there in the sedimentary rock. By the way, you can't fold a solid rock. You have to fold it while it's soft. It was all soft when it was coming to a crashing halt. So, yeah, it was at the compression event at the very end of the flood. Yes?
When you watch some of these programs on like the Science Channel or History Channel, like How the Universe Works or Through the Wormhole, it's interesting now that they're saying that, perhaps some, if not all of our water came from comets, and also the organic compounds that we have on Earth may have been extraterrestrial from asteroids and comets. So it seems like they may have it exactly wrong, opposite.
Exactly
and
opposite.
Perhaps they've read Dr. Brown's material and they're trying to reverse that.
That's a very good point. I'm really glad you brought it up, because a few years ago, I could ask Dr. Brownlee, when you get stardust back, when you get the build 2 comet dust back, what are you going to find? Are you going to find left-hand amino acids and deuterium and all this other stuff? Like, oh, no, we're not going to find that. We're going to find the beginning of the stuff. So then they get this stuff, and they say, oh, well, for many decades, scientists have been trying to explain how on a life planet, molecules can just, without any input from us, can create organic molecules all by themselves, and amino acids all by themselves. But we flamed out. We can't do it. We sure wish we could, because we could silence all those creationists. We could just make them all go away. Oh, here's our solution. In the deep darkness of space, where everything's frozen at near absolute zero, that's where amino acids came from. That's where bacteria came from. That's where all this stuff, and they landed on Earth and they brought life to here, to this Earth. Now I'm insane. But see, the evolution, what the Bible says, is because people, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, because people will not believe the truth, God gives them over to a delusion that they believe the lie, because they did not have a love of the truth. That they would believe the lie. And so, I said earlier, hey, this is gravity and math. That's all it is. And so it would win the arguments. And I should have put a little asterisk next to that. Unless people are just absolutely committed to believing the lie. In which case, they cannot receive the truth. The truth becomes the lie to them, and the lie becomes the truth. But there's some people that this information can change. So that's a very good point. They're now saying, we got all this stuff, we've been seeded, Earth has been seeded. And the more they find this life out on there, out in the solar system, the more they're going to start changing the textbook. Hey kids, life came from, not from aliens that didn't seed us. No, it was comets, asteroids, that sent this life to Earth. instead of a life planet jettisoning stuff up, and wouldn't you expect to see those evidences of life on those objects?
Well, we are all stardust, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. So very, very good point how that's changed. Yes.
Yeah, during the break, I seem to heard you saying something about human-initiated.
Right.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, when Kent Hovind and I were talking, because he says, oh, I really like Dr. Brown's work, and this is before you went to the federal prison. And I sell this book and everything, but I disagree with Dr. Brown. I said, why? And he said, because, and he said, because Dr. Brown has this, his initial conditions are that the crust is going to rupture, which means that it was not good at the beginning. So recall that? I mean, if the temperature is just increasing, the pressure is increasing, then the crust is going to rupture. And I said, but your theory is that the flood occurred by a comet striking the Earth and killing all life and leaving water and flooding everything, which doesn't explain where the water went after it flooded. And he goes, yeah, that's my theory. And I go, so when was the comet made? And he goes, at creation. And so when God made that comet at creation, it had its orbit destined to run into planet Earth. And yeah, so he had a problem. So anyway, Walt realizes it was not good if this process of increasing the temperature and pressure in the subterranean water would have, by default, had to have failed the crust. And the answer to that is, as the supercritical water would have been dissolving more and more of the crust, there would have been less and less tidal pumping, and therefore heat being generated in the crust. It would have been going up into the crustal thickness, and so there would be less water. And that there would have been more and more temperature being added, more geothermal heat being emitted as it got closer to the Earth's surface, and that there would have been a time of equilibrium where it would all equalize out. And so he theorizes that in any number of things, man did something to, hey, what's going on with the Earth? We see a little bit of a bowing up and down. Let's drill a hole. You drill a hole, you're going to unleash the powers of the supercritical water, and you're off and running. So that he theorizes man did something. Doesn't know what wasn't there, doesn't know, the Bible doesn't tell us. But he thinks there would have been an equilibrium that would have been reached over time, and it did not have to fail. So, any others?
Is there any thought of a polar or magnetic shift during this time?
Pardon?
Is there any thought of a polar or magnetic shift during this time?
Earth's magnetic field, there was a magnetic field before the flood, probably a lot less, but a majority of Earth's magnetic field, according to Dr. Brown's theory, by the way, that what's taught in science till recently is that it's circulating currents in the liquid outer core, creating an electrical field of electrical current, but there's many serious problems with that. You can search on Dr. Brown's website and get the answer to that, but the strength of the magnetic field of the Earth was created when the inner core was created as the melting of the inner Earth. So say one more time the question, because I don't think that totally answered it.
Oh, I'm just curious.
Okay.
Because I've heard about polar shifts or the
Yep.
theories of polar shifts or magnetic flips.
Yeah, okay, so the
I'm just curious if there's any part of that.
Okay.
Just any connection.
Yeah, we could, to answer that would take another 5 minutes. I fear read Dr. Brown's work, and there's a place in Washington State, southeast Washington State, where they think they proved, and it actually, Brian Nichols covers that. If you listen to all 6 of Brian Nichols' presentations on YouTube for free, he answers that question. I can't remember which one it is. Yeah.
And my husband might be going to ask the same question, but since you brought up magnetism, what about the theory that Thornhill and Talbot had made about the electric universe? How might that, and there are some Christians who have elaborated on that, gotten away from, the non-Christian view. Have you heard that theory?
You know what, I heard the electric universe theory, and it's a whole different theory on how comets came about. I'm not studying enough to speak to it. Yeah, so, but I know it's out there. It's really gained a lot of popularity. There's the planet Nibiru, and that's out there, and it's all this other stuff that's out there. Again, in my simple mind, I just look at all this evidence, and so here it is. And I could go and research all this stuff, and some friends of mine have sent me clips. I watched like an hour of one of their presentations, but as soon as I realized that they were saying that when they sent that 400-pound copper slug into that one comet, and how that was a burst of electrical lightning that came out to that copper slug, proving the electric universe when it was just comets are made of dust, and as soon as it hit that through the dust up, that would have created all the brightness that we saw on the space probe. So it just became too hard to discern what's the truth and what's not, and so I just want to spend time on what seems to be so clear cut. Yeah.
So the electric universe folks are saying that Newton's laws work fairly well in a small space like our solar system, but outside of that, there are all kinds of issues, and they're trying to replace the use of Newton's laws with Maxwell's equations for electricity.
Yeah.
Point out that the universe is primarily plasma, and these equations will really give you a pretty good idea about how it works. They probably have some good ideas, and they're trying to explain most everything, just like Walt Brown is, right? And they suck it in close when they take this data and say it looks like this, it looks like that. And that's creating a lot of controversy in the astrophysics area, which is needed, I think, in my opinion, that people need to dig into that and sort that stuff out.
Right. Yeah. And seriously, there might be some good stuff in what they're saying. See, plasma is not a well understood, and there's things about plasma fields like the creation of superfusion atoms that then fission in an adiabatic relationship that are new. It's new to science. And so, they might have some good stuff. I'm just not educated enough to really follow it and be able to make a call one way or the other. Yeah.
You said that roughly the 3% of the pre-flood when the Earth was ejected.
Yep.
And that's comprising the comets, all the asteroids between Mars and Jupiter, or it was some of the...
All of them.
I thought the mass of the asteroids between Jupiter and Mars were roughly about the size of Mars. The mass of
No. In fact, that video that we had from Brian Nichols, they originally thought the asteroids were an exploded planet. But when they started adding up all the masses of these things, which takes quite a while because you've got to study the orbits and everything, it turns out to be 0.03% of Earth. It would have been extremely small. Cirrus, the one asteroid Cirrus, which is not that big, is 1/3 of the mass of all the asteroids in the asteroid belt.
So I'm looking off the Mars plus, okay, so the comets, the asteroids, the loose objects, and the TNOs equal.
The TNOs are the huge addition because Pluto is huge. That's what
Pluto itself is ejected mass.
Ejected mass.
Okay.
But to clarify, all the debris that became Pluto was injected mass. Again, to get rid of that idea, when I first would say this, people would go, "Kevin, are you saying Pluto?" No, Earth didn't spit out Pluto. It spit out the debris that became Pluto.
Can you figure out, or could it be figured out, considering the moon was there before the flood?
Right.
The angle of where this stuff must have been ejected so it didn't...
so it wouldn't hit the moon? That's why we have... That's why we have the 5 mass concentrations that we see every night. The face of the moon is because I even have an animation here for Brian Nichols. We don't have time to show. If it ejects and the moon is coming along, let me read this maybe final point. How long did it take the moon to go around the Earth pre-flood? By all calendars of antiquity, 30 days. How long did it take for the Earth to go around the sun pre-flood? By all ancient calendars, exactly 360 days. So why is it 28 days and why is it 365 days? And the debris, and same professor, Air Force Academy professor, said that only a small percentage of what was ejected from the Earth by Walt's theory impacted the moon, very small percentage. It would have altered moon's orbit into its now not perfectly eccentric and 28-day, because if you slow down the moon, it then whips around the Earth faster. So its orbit is now 28 days instead of 30 days. In fact, it's believed that this is why, and people have done massive research on this. Why did they build Stonehenge? Why did the Egyptians build these things that were all tied to studying the solar system and relationship? Is because Noah and his sons, they said, okay, it's time to start planting crops again. And we know after 1,000 years of doing this, we know we need to plant. And so they start planting it. Every year it's getting, whoa, wait a second. How come we're off? And Earth started spinning faster because the inner Earth melted as a result of the ridge forming. And that centers down the melting and condensing, the density increased in the melt. And that's just like a skater that goes into a spin, pulls your arms in, what happens? You spin faster. So now you're spinning around 5 more times per year around the sun. And so that's why, God said that I made the moon and the stars and the sun as time measurements. That's what he said in Genesis. They're not good time measurements now. They were in the beginning exactly 30 days, exactly 360 days. They were perfect timing mechanisms. Something happened to the Earth. Only the Hydroplate theory can explain both of those. And why there's mass counts on the moon. Yeah.
Was the Earth tilted?
Yeah, the Earth was tilted. Yeah, because you would have wanted to create the Earth tilted to give the seasons, because it's also.
There were no seasons, or there was no seed time to harvest. Things were disrupted after the sin and before the flood. There were no regular seasons. That's my understanding.
And the Bible doesn't say there was no seasons. In fact, it says that
seed time and harvest were not regular.
Well, what I'm saying is you get both southern and northern hemispheres are going to get a lot more food growing capability by the fact that the Earth is slightly angled.
But if you live closer to the equator, that's less important.
Yeah. So I know we're going way late. JD, are we violating anything here? I promise I'm going to stay here to all the questions that I can answer, but are we okay? Are we done? Or is there any other question? Okay. Yes?
Well, just to build on what you said, is that a partial explanation then for the craters on the Moon and Mars as the debris was passing through those areas?
Yeah. Again, Mars. See, Mars would have been pummeled by the debris, liquid and solid debris from Earth. It would have been pummeled. This debris is going everywhere, and as it's spiraling out, along comes Mars and sucks a bunch in, and bam! And that's why they were shocked to find actual rivers. The sign that liquid water flowed on this planet, whose average temperature is minus 100 and whatever degrees Fahrenheit. How did liquid water run lakes of it? And oh, by the way, that water was high in deuterium. It also had salt. And so Mars got pummeled, and the impact of the debris in the water from a wannabe comet that ran into Mars and couldn't mature in life hits and creates tremendous energy in a crater that keeps the water liquid as it runs out and burrows a riverbed and erodes the sides of channels and goes into the ground, and then it vaporizes into the Mars, sublimates into Mars' atmosphere over the time, and then the solar wind takes it away from Mars and strips it away, and people are befuddled. How did this happen? The flood of Noah, Hydroplate theory. Sorry.